at Fair Election Center, which means I am on the legal team for 1 year. I started last August, which was a very interesting time to start. And on the legal team, we do a whole lot of things. We challenge bad voting laws through litigation. We also challenge bad voting laws through legislative advocacy. And then we also try to get some better voting laws passed also through legislative advocacy, and just try to keep track of everything that's going on. But I'm sure other folks will have more to add to that.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Sherman. I'm the litigation director and senior counsel, one of the senior counsel at Fair Election Center. I think Katie nailed what we do. That's sort of the tools that we use to try to reform our elections and make them more accessible and more democratic, make the country more democratic. And we have a pretty strong focus on voting access as opposed to redistricting and campaign finance reform. So that is sort of our bread and butter, both in litigation, in the fighting in the courts, and also fighting in state legislatures and somewhat in Congress now too.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is John Alex Soldado. I'm with Miami-Dade College, Institute for Civic Engagement.
Hey, John Alex. This is for our panelists. So this is a—
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry.
I appreciate your enthusiasm.
Hey, I'm Mike Burns, he, him, inside Fair Election Center, and I direct our Campus Vote project, which is obviously probably more familiar to all of you, the work that we do directly with campuses, and is the team that leads the fellowship program with the state coordinators, as well as our other national team members. So Rahila and Nicola, and now Dylan, who used to be in Ohio, will be our HBCU manager, and also Rachel, our former North Carolina coordinator, and I'll be regional organizer. So hang out with those folks during the day.
Awesome. Well, thank you for introducing yourselves. So I'm just going to hop right into the questions, if that's okay. And if you just want to unmute yourself whenever you're ready to answer, and if two of you go at once, no big deal. Just we can all answer them. But the first one says, can each of you describe how you ended up in your current positions and why you wanted to work in the voting rights space?
I can go first. I can jump in. So I come to this work somewhat. I started in this line of work 10 years ago, almost exactly a decade ago, right after a major midterm election, which saw a lot of state houses flip, state legislatures flip around the country, and in 2011. We were dealing, it's like deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra used to say. We were dealing with a wave of voter identification laws and other voter suppression measures that were passed all around the country, in reaction to the 2008 election of President Barack Obama that saw a groundswell of younger, more diverse electorate electing their candidate of choice. So I sort of cut my teeth at the ACLU Voting Rights Project. That was my first gig in the voting rights community. Brought the first federal challenge to Wisconsin's voter ID law back then. That case is still pending, nearly a decade later. I filed it November of 2011. It's still kicking around up and down. It's been up to the circuit court 3 times and back. And it was also a redistricting cycle. We at the Fair Election Center, like I said before, we don't focus on redistricting, but it was a redistricting cycle back then, as it is now, though it's quite delayed for reasons you all know. The census just doesn't seem to know where to put the data. And so I did do an amount of, putting together maps for redistricting and challenging existing maps. And we can talk some about what that work looks like, but in short, it was, I went to, for instance, to Montgomery County Commission with a proposal to create 3 majority-minority districts in a town that is in an area that is majority minority, yet because of gerrymandering had never elected 3 African Americans, had never elected a majority of the 5-member commission. They'd always been dominated by white commissioners in Alabama. So you can imagine how that goes. And, have challenged, for instance, the same on the West Coast in Washington State. We challenged the lack of Latino representation on city councils in places like Yakima, where there was just no Latino representation for the numerous Latino voters there. So that was sort of how I got my start in this field, and sort of stuck with it ever since. I graduated law school just a year or two before that. Clerked for a second time in Phoenix, Arizona after the ACLU on an appellate court. And then when I left that clerkship in Arizona, I wanted to rejoin the community, was moving to DC. And this was a small shop that was doing exciting stuff. And there was a lot of freedom to sort of create your own cases, bring, novel constitutional claims to attack longstanding and new voter suppression measures. And we have litigated, everything under the sun, from felon disenfranchisement, reenfranchisement schemes, to proof of citizenship laws, to restrictions on student voting. And we'll talk more about that.
You want to go, Katie?
Sure, I'll go. I was about to bug you too, but yeah, so I'm just going to start with why I'm interested in voting rights stuff generally. So my family has always been really big on voting and civic engagement. My dad is an immigrant. He moved to the US from Taiwan before he was of voting age, but with siblings who were of voting age. And they definitely had some hurdles that they had to face when they were becoming citizens and, getting their voting rights and becoming eligible to vote. So they've always just kind of hammered that home, along with being involved in civic engagement more generally. So then in undergrad, I did some local organizing around some campaigns and issues that I cared about. And throughout that, I got lots of experience talking one-on-one with voters, making sure that folks are registered to vote, just kind of navigating through, deadlines and all of those things. And that was a real eye-opening experience for me, because I'm from Washington State and it seems very easy to vote. We're all mail voting, male as in USPS, not male as in gender. Anyway, but there were still so many hurdles that people faced, figuring out what to do if their ballot doesn't come, and where they're allowed to drop their ballot off if they are temporarily away from home, and all of those things. So those little details matter in every single state, even the ones with good voting laws. And so when I went to law school, I had that experience under my belt from organizing, and I wanted to continue learning about it and just kind of learning about the legal structures that prop up those rules. So I spent one of my summers also at the ACLU Voting Rights Project, learning more about it, and was very lucky to land this fellowship for as soon as I graduated law school, and have learned so much more since starting last August. I think there are a whole lot of routes to get here, to be honest. And I think that being involved with organizing and just caring about these issues generally is a great place to start.
Yeah, I've been with Campus Vote Project for going on 7 years now, just the longest I've done anything in my life, mostly. Definitely anything professional for sure. Longer than as long as I was in undergrad and law school combined. So going back some, I graduated from undergrad and I had a poli-sci degree, and I lived here at the time I lived in Northern Virginia. I live on the other side of the city, up in the burbs again. And I didn't really know what to do with that. I just figured you go to DC and then you find a job and you do politics, right? So I just started knocking on a bunch of doors and dropping off a bunch of resumes. And lo and behold, everyone was just like, so what can you actually do? And I was like, well, I read about a bunch of political campaigns in school. How about that? And they were like, no, 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 no. So anywho, I volunteered for my first campaign. And I feel like they also didn't realize what they were signing up for, because they asked me when I could come back, and I said tomorrow. And then they said, when can you come back again? And I said tomorrow, like I don't have a job. And I showed up until they gave me a job. And then I did that for 5 years. I did a bunch of political campaigns, mainly around Virginia. Went on the road for then Senator Obama in 2008, did a bunch of states in the primary, and ended up back in Virginia working directly for the party for about 2 years, and realized that if I wanted to keep doing that work, I either had to go like back on the road and start working statewide races, or get another skill set and find another job. So I went to law school. And that was great. I loved it. We can talk more about that later on this panel. I don't know about Katie and John's experience, but I will say, like, after 5 years of political campaigns, going to law school didn't seem that bad to me. It's a lot of work. There's like a ton of reading. I was not reading that much before law school, for sure, on my own time, but just to be back in control of my own schedule again was like pretty impressive, because in campaign world, I worked in the office all day, and then I did events with volunteers in the public in the evening and on the weekends. So I really enjoyed it, and was fortunate enough to actually have a friend who was in one of the organizations that used to share office space with the Fair Election Center. And I was taking a lighter load my last semester because I had enough credits from some summer work and journal and stuff before. So started working for the Fair Election Center part-time, and then was even more fortunate to be able to come on after the bar and start working with them full-time. And when I took this position with the Fair Election Center, I got hired to be an attorney and do CVP some of the time. And now in the last 7 years, we've gotten to the point where, you know, as soon as we fill our North Carolina position, we'll have 15 folks who work full-time on Campus Vote Project, which just like blows my mind every time I think about it. Or maybe 14, I guess, is where we're at. I don't know. I have to count. There's enough people now that I can't do it just on my fingers, and I have to sit down and actually look at it. So, yeah, so that's how I got here, but it was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed it. I will say I like tried to do other things in law school and just did not like them. Like, I went to law school to learn about the law, and they like make you pick all your first own classes the first year. They just like tell you what to do most places. And my brother does like corporate litigation in Delaware, and he was like, I want to talk to you about my job because no one at my house like wants to hear me talk about that, and now you're in law school, so you have to. And I was like, oh, I have bad news for you. I do not care about shareholders. I do not care about the board. Like, it just is boring, and I couldn't get into it. And by the time I graduated, I was right back to doing political work, and was very fortunate to find a home at Fair Election Center to be able to get back to doing what I was interested in, but in a different way.
Awesome. Well, thank you for answering that question. So I'm going to move on to the next one. This one says, what advice do you have for students who are interested in pursuing legal careers, especially in defending voting rights? So Katie, I'm going to ask you to start, and then John or Mike, one of y'all can go after her.
Yeah, so for law school generally, basically, if you are considering becoming a lawyer and you tell people that, you will without a doubt be told, don't go to law school. Somebody will say, hey, that's not what you actually want. And like, maybe that's true, maybe that's not what you want, but like also maybe it is. I know for me, I took 1 year off in between undergrad and law school to be a legal assistant at a local law firm in Seattle. And that was a really great experience. I highly recommend doing that. Just making sure you know like what lawyers do on a day-to-day basis, because it's not always exciting, especially if you go into a like corporate lawyer space, which I did, and I might not recommend that part of it. If you can get a cooler, more fun position, I would definitely recommend doing that instead. As far as going to law school with like voting rights in mind, you know, for me, I think part of it was just really lucky in where I fell into my like summer internships, but part of it was also connecting with other students who are also voting rights and election law nerds. like I got to work with a couple other students and co-found a student group just based around those issues, where we get to hear from practitioners, where we volunteered, where we got everyone at the law school registered to vote, where we got people kind of like funnel into the poll worker space. And like that was really meaningful. And I feel like I have a lot of long-term connections with those folks, and a lot of people who can help like mentor me or steer me in the right direction when I want to work in a voting rights space. So, you know, the connections that you're making with your fellow students and with your fellow organizers, like I feel like those are super important and can take you a long way.
Can add a little bit to that, you know, which I think is a good inside look of how people sort of chart their path to law school, and then once they're in law school, how they chart, you know, their interests and sort of develop while they're there. And like everything in life, right, there is a bit of like randomness and luck involved. One of the nice things, you know, I will say, look, it's been 21 years since Bush v. Gore, which is sort of how I first, when I was in college, that was like the most important thing that had happened, that in 9/11, of course. And Bush v. Gore was like, for election law and election administration and voting rights, that was 9/11, right? That was the moment that set off the race to control every single part of the election code. From, you know, it didn't quite hit full stride until what I was talking about earlier, until 2011. But for every piece of identification, every rule about registration, every rule about when, where, how, who gets to vote, all of that sort of became up for grabs, because if you can get a presidential election decided by a couple hundred votes, well, guess what? Every single rule matters. The nice thing, in the 20 years since, you know, I've first been paying attention to this, the number of jobs that are related to democracy, where you can meaningfully participate in promoting our democracy and safeguarding all different aspects of it, from the right to vote to, you know, protecting against corruption, to working on redistricting, has gone up dramatically. The press on this space has gone up dramatically, and the opportunities have gone up on it dramatically. And some of these positions, you know, in this space, in this community, definitely require a law degree, and some don't. And I think it's important, you know, to step back sometime. If you are thinking about law school, make sure, if this is the path you want to be on and the community you want to be on, make sure it's like what you want to be doing in the course of the day, because no one will doubt your commitment to the cause. But, you know, a lot of the time what we're doing, what Katie and I are doing, what Mike to some extent too is doing, you know, we're in the weeds on election codes. We're researching really arcane points of law. You know, is that what you want to be doing? What I'll say for my part, what I love about it is litigation. At least I love the ability to file a lawsuit and try to make change that way, right? When we lose in the legislatures and have no recourse because the dominant majority in that legislature has just told us no, flat out, we have to resort to the Constitution. We have to resort to the courts. And the law is a language of action. It's action and reaction. Who are we? We're nobody. But we file something and they have to respond, right? And our clients, who are the real people, the real protagonists, they're quite brave, and they get to stand up for constitutional rights and bring their fight into the courts. And the state has to answer. The state or the county, they have to answer and say exactly why they're burdening those constitutional rights, exactly why they're denying someone the right to vote. They have to provide a response, and if it's not a good response, well, then they lose. And that's the kind of tug of war we're involved in every cycle. And that's one argument, I think, for, if you like that, it's not always researching the right to vote. Sometimes it's very boring procedural requirements, but that's how you win, right? Like, it is that language of power in the law is really sometimes a contestation over who gets access to what evidence and what documents, which can be exciting. It can also be boring depending on your perspective.
Yeah, I will say, like, I think law school gives you a great toolbox to like solve problems. Um, so I'll maybe start with that, but then I do think you don't have to know exactly what you want to do, but you should have like a good idea. Like if you want to go practice corporate law, if you want to do that, then like you should go to like a top 14 law school because that is really important to them and that is how you will get one of those jobs. If there are other things that you're interested in, but you think that a legal education will give you the tools to help do that job better, to better understand policy, to better understand laws, to be a better advocate, then like there are lots of law schools in the country. And there's a decent chance like lots of you are really smart. Some of them will probably give you some money to go there and help reduce the cost. So I think like Katie was saying, I'd never try and tell folks not to go to law school if that's what you are interested in doing, but try and have a plan for how you're going to pay for law school. I think is what I would say, because especially if you want to come into like the nonprofit space, it's just there's always a squeeze. Like there is always a need for more people who have that skill set to do the work, to be in that space, and it is hard to get the salary to pay back law school debt in the nonprofit world. Especially like even in voting rights, like John said, like it was minuscule before, and it has been growing and expanding for a while now, but it is still a relatively small sector, quote unquote, I would say. And there's, especially within that too, there's even probably a smaller number of people who do what John does and what Katie is doing now, like actually litigating in the voting rights space is an even smaller community. So like I would, if that's the trajectory you really want to be on, like that one, just like know that there's definitely a need for it. And I think it's really exciting and important, but it's a small piece of it. But there are lots of other things that you can do with a law degree, especially that are like related to democracy reform. I spend, like I said, I have a real mix in my day. I spend a lot of time thinking about organizing. I think a lot of time thinking about education and how we take that legal expertise that our team has and the focus we have on being in the weeds and like use that to explain the law to other people to help them navigate it successfully for folks who do encounter those barriers. So there's a lot of different things to do with a legal degree, but it can be, it can definitely be hard to pay that back if you either can't get money to go to law school or go somewhere very expensive and then want to work in the nonprofit space. So I think that's just the flag that I would put out there is, follow your bliss there. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. If you've ever argued with someone about punctuation, then like maybe law school is for you, but definitely try and at least have a good idea on the trajectory that you might want to do afterwards so that you can align the schools that you're applying to and the places you go to get the skill set you want and then be able to handle those loans.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Just as a little side note, if you didn't see Cassie's message in the chat a minute ago, you can drop any questions that you have. We're going to take about 15 or 20 minutes at the end to answer some audience questions. And so if you have any, you can obviously unmute yourself at the end, but if you have a question that you have right now, you can just drop it in the chat. And then we'll try to get to that one in a little while. So, okay, our next question. Thank you guys for answering that one. It says, what are best practices to support legislation in our communities and in our local governments? John, do you want to start this one?
Sorry, I'm trying to see the question again.
Oh, you're good.
Read it out again?
Yeah, sure. You want me to read it out again, you said?
Interested in pursuing. Oh, I see it now. Sorry. What are best practices?
Yeah, no, you're good.
Oh, there's so much there. I mean, there are coalitions and organizations that are devoted to this at a statewide and a local level. And I think, wherever you are, that's where we are, right? We're an organization, we're participating in those coalitions. And I think if you want to be engaged in those, legislative and to some extent municipal policy fights, sign up with organizations that are working on it. You can be a member of, any number of organizations, the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, NAACP, and then there are there are lots of state-based groups that don't get as much notoriety, but you'll know them if you're in state, like in North Carolina, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, Block in Milwaukee, that's Black leaders organizing communities. There are so many different organizations in this space, because I think everyone, finally 21 years since Bush v. Gore, everyone I think gets now that nothing can happen, literally nothing on any area of policy you care about, which is whether it's criminal justice reform, climate change, reproductive rights, nothing happens unless unless our democracy functions properly. So for anyone who cares about any of those issues, if you want to be involved in the democracy side of it, I would suggest working with those organizations, even if you're just a member, making calls, writing letters, or going further into testifying and lobbying, whether it's in a city council hearing or a state legislative hearing. It's a lot of what the three of us are doing right now. Is a lot of these legislative sessions are cooking, and as it was 10 years ago, remember I said it was deja vu, they are cooking hottest and fastest in the states where certain people are not happy with the outcome from last year, such as Arizona, where I work, and Georgia, where Katie is doing a lot of work, and to some extent North Carolina, where Mike does a lot of work. It's a fight. Like right now, the fight over the 2024 presidential election is on. It's on right now. It's on every single minute that these laws are being debated. Your right to vote is being contested right now in hearings across the country.
Well, that was terrifying to hear. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. I think something that's really like struck me lately is how powerful like individual stories are. So if you had to overcome a hurdle when you were voting, or if one of your friends had to overcome a hurdle when they were voting, I think telling that story really matters. And there are a whole bunch of places where you could tell that story. You could tell it in a legislative hearing, kind of in the way that we are, but especially in this like particular time, even just tweeting out a little thread about what happened and how difficult it was for you or your friend to vote. I feel like that can gain a lot of traction, and I've been seeing that gain a lot of traction lately. I'm sure you all have as well. I think because so many of us are in this space and trying to organize around it and trying to like make the decision makers hear those stories, we have your back, and we're like willing to amplify that and make sure that your voice does come before the people who can change that situation. So, it doesn't always have to be the super official thing. Like it's great if you can get into a city council meeting. It's great if you can zoom into a hearing, but even just using social media can work a lot as well, I think.
Yeah, I think building on what Katie was saying too, like also the more local it is, the louder your voice a lot of times. But, like we were just talking today about, there was literally a split vote in Arizona, right? That kicked this bill back down because literally one person broke with their party. Alaska just like has a weird coalition of like Democrats and independents, and like they got like a Republican and they got him to be chair, but he's part of this coalition that's not with the Republicans. And it's like you get down to the more local level, and there is a lot of deal making going on with individual personalities involved, and hearing those real stories from real people like impacts those folks. And the smaller those districts get, the more and more important every individual voter and every individual voice is, and you'd have a lot more amplification, I've noticed, in doing some of this work. So I think that's always important. Like it's great to be able to get a lot of people together and show strength in numbers, but also on some of these things, like the closer the fight is to home, the easier it is to get more influence with fewer folks.
There's also no filibuster, which is a nice bonus of the local level. I forgot to mention Fair Fight too. You should also just like follow Stacey Abrams on Twitter and listen to everything she says, because she is, I'm not exaggerating when I call her visionary. She should win a Nobel Prize for the work she's done.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for answering that. I have one more question before we go into the audience questions. Some people have dropped some in the chat. So awesome. So I'm going to go on to the last question. And if Mike, you want to start this one, that would be great. So this is number 5. It says, what facts can we bring in to defend the idea that young people are not apathetic when we know that there are barriers to student voting?
Oh my gosh, 2020, 2018. Like, I think we have seen just a growing trend in the time that I've been in this work. Like when we first started, I used to hear that a lot. Like young people don't care and that's why they don't vote and they're not interested. And even when we started back then, I knew that that was bullshit. It just was harder to punch holes in it, but also was like a little bit of a fulfilling prophecy. You know, like a lot of campaigns, they spend money on registered voters and they spend money on voters who have a track record. Like they buy access to, like most folks probably here know, like the voter file. Like in most jurisdictions, if you are a politician, you can buy the voter file and get access to people's vote history, and you know not who they voted for, but that the person down the street who's 65 and has 100% score in the last 10 elections, pretty good person for you to talk to because the likelihood they're going to vote is very high. But when we have new voters coming into the system or folks moving around and crossing state lines, some of that, even if you voted before, some of that history can get lost. And then there's just this cycle where those folks are like, well, it's easier for me to just talk to folks who I know are more likely to vote and try and convince them to vote for me than to help other people navigate the system and get involved. But I think we've seen a real surgence in the work of community groups like ours, to young people in general. Some of the data out of Circle about the number of young people who volunteered or helped a peer register to vote or shared information about the election with peers is just like through the roof compared to some of the previous election cycles. And the turnout numbers for 2018 and 2020 for young voters, and hopefully when we get the data from NSOLV on student voters in particular, it was incredibly high in 18. We actually saw the gap shrink in 2018. So in 2018, we saw like the electorate expanded a lot across all the age groups over 2014, but expanded even more among young voters to the point where we actually saw the gap start to close, that like historic gap that we know of between the kind of youngest and oldest voters. So just call bullshit bullshit is the short version of my answer.
I have nothing to add. That's, yeah.
Mike is the guru on this in our office, so I don't have a ton to add either. But what I will add one thing, which is student voters have been targeted in voter suppression bills now for upwards of a decade. And there's a reason for that. And it's not that student voters are apathetic, it's that student voters are voting and people do not like them voting. There's a reason that Tennessee's voter ID law lets anyone with a college degree, college or university degree, use their college or university degree to vote, but not students. So that if you're on the, say, oh, I don't know, UT Knoxville basketball team, your coach can use his school ID, but none of the players can use their IDs. It's the same ID. There's a reason the law is that way, and it's because students have been exercising their rights in greater and greater numbers. And that was a direct reaction to the unbelievable turnout of young people in the 2008 election. And that's only been rising since then.
Awesome. Katie, did you want to add anything about that?
No, just call bullshit bullshit. I agree.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So a couple people dropped some in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and read those. The first one says, as someone who is entering into law school in the fall, does the Fair Election Center have any intern opportunities for new law school students, or just fellowships like Katie's after graduation? Anybody can answer this one.
We do have internships, both summer internships and term time internships. Our term time usually is, I mean, there are certainly some schools, some law schools that allow a current law student to like come to DC and work, or in this pandemic context, just to work remotely for, you know, full time. And most of the time we have someone that's part-time in one of the local DC schools. But yeah, we've had interns around the, you know, year round.
John, can I ask a clarifying question for everyone? I will I will elevate for y'all. Where does that usually get posted when you do have internships?
Usually it's on our website. I think there's a careers or opportunities in one of the drop downs. But we also post it on sources like Idealist and PSJD, which is the public service jobs directory. It's usually up in all those places.
Awesome. The next one says, specifically for those wanting to work in nonprofit voting rights in a particular state, is it better to attend a higher ranked school out of state or better to attend a pretty decently ranked school within that state if it means that you get to gain experience and knowledge of the state's issues and developments in election law? And the writer, I don't see it. I don't know who said it, but they said they can explain if that was confusing.
Okay, I'll take a stab at this. So first of all, the lawyer answers, it depends. If you know the particular nonprofit that you want to work at, like if you have one or maybe even two in mind, you can look at who they hire and see if they went to one of the top law schools and or if they're like more folks who stayed local. And like the brutal truth is a lot of organizations do like very much prioritize just like the top 3 law schools or maybe the top 14. And like, yes, that is entirely messed up. But depending on what you want to do, it might be something that you have to consider. And, I feel like this also goes along with what Mike was talking about with like the scholarship, the potential scholarships that you can get. And, a lot of times you can go to a local law school and get out debt free. And, that's a very real consideration. But I feel like everybody's like individual situation is going to vary a lot, both like financially and with like career goals and, personal family connections, all of those things. So it's like really hard to say like overall, but, I think the easiest way, like the way I figured out what I wanted to do was talking one-on-one with people who knew me and my situation super well and were like willing to, chat with me about their experience and, apply it to my own. So like, I'm very willing to talk with you one-on-one about those things if you want. But it's just going to vary so much that it's really hard to give a blanket answer.
Mike, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think complicates this too is like pre-pandemic, I think it might have weighed more one way than the other. Like there was a lot to be said for proximity and the ability to do things, right? Like I started working at the Fair Election Center while I was still in law school because I was in DC. Like going to law school in DC meant that I did a lot of like the competitiveness for internships in DC in the summer is insane because everyone is trying to come to DC from everywhere else in the country. But during the semester, I was able to go to a bunch of places and be like, oh, do you have semester internships? And I will make them work into my schedule because I am here all the time. And it was a lot easier to connect to folks on the Hill or do things like that when it wasn't as competitive during the summer. And I feel like it could be the same if you're trying to do that locally or connect with local groups. But now that we've all learned that we can do everything from remote if we have to, I don't know if that'll be quite the same in a post-pandemic world. But I definitely still something to be said for proximity and networking.
I'll second what Katie said about it being organization specific, and I think you should just research the bios of the folks who are working there. I tend to think beyond the big national organizations like the ACLU. Like if you're focused on an organization that is just in your state and only in their state, I mean, you're going to have to take the bar somewhere, right? And showing some both local knowledge, state specific knowledge, and a commitment to that state that you're not just going to do this for a year or two and then, flee to another state, right? They want to invest in you because every year they invest in you, the thought of you sticking around for maybe longer, that's an investment well spent. If they have to do it all over again in 2 years because you ultimately just wanted to go to New York or DC, maybe it makes you less attractive to them. So I think there's something really to be said for attending school. Like if you want to work at a Southern civil rights organization, it doesn't have to necessarily be in the same state, but maybe somewhere in the South. So you gain more knowledge about, that area. I think it just really depends. And I will say too, big thing about law school, right? While you're there, you'll be able to engage in all sorts of term time internships, clinics, right? Working with community organizations, working with clients, and on issues that are local, right? There are things you can do at at a law school in LA that you can't do at a law school in Connecticut, right? You can't, right? Or even in Palo Alto, right? There are real, world, really challenging issues, social issues in LA, and being in that city means you will have the opportunity at least to work on those, whether they're landlord tenant issues, whether they're issues of poverty or racial discrimination, right? Those are things that you can engage in while you're still in law school and just be an apprentice, right there. So I think there's a lot of value. That's something that's sometimes understated, right? No matter where you go, if you're in the top 25, 30 law schools, there'll be good clinics. But being in a particular community where there are issues that you want to work on, that really can't be, the value of that can't be overstated.
Yeah, I will
Anybody
say,
who, oh, sorry, I was about to ask if anybody else wanted to answer, but you go, you're good.
yeah, the last thing I would just add is, and John can probably actually speak to this better, but I would say especially like federal clerkships are still like, they are very competitive, and that is still, I feel like, pretty part of like old world law school, where like the law school you're at and its rank and your class rank are very important to things like that. But on the flip side, I would say again too, like I know a lot of folks who I went to law school in DC who were able to do even like clerkships, but at the local level, and do it during like term time, as opposed to doing some of the more competitive ones when like everyone from all law schools are competing for those.
I will say I applied to a federal judge, not even a state judge, a federal judge in Austin, Texas. And informally, as a rule, they basically just did not consider people who were not from Texas. So, who weren't coming from a Texas law school. So, it cuts both directions. And like, look, Katie, Mike, and I are saying, some of the things that work for us to get where we are. Like, I think the golden rule is what worked for us won't work for you. And like, we can't, and like what works for you won't work for someone else. Like each of these paths, I think you got to sort of like feel it out and chart it out sort of yourself. And it's going to be some trial and error, but that's sort of figuring out what kind of advocate or lawyer you want to become.
Awesome. Those are great answers. Thank you so much. Okay, so this last question from the chat says, does the federal public loan forgiveness program help law school grads working for public interest nonprofits in the long term?
Didn't Betsy DeVos blow that up? Is that still a thing? I don't actually know.
Yeah, no one in like the first year when it would have been eligible, like 10 years after, I think like 5 people actually got approved or something absurd like that, but it has supposedly been getting better. I am not there yet, but my understanding is that yes, if you work for a like C3 nonprofit, you can get federal loan forgiveness. The part that I need to look up that I'm unsure about is that it still counts as taxable income. So especially for like the amount of debt that you might have at law school, especially if you're on like, right, like I'm on income based in the hopes that eventually I'll get what's left forgiven. But when I first started at CVP, my salary was very low. So those were very small payments. So there's a lot of interest just stacked up now that I'm hoping gets forgiven. But then it'll be a pretty big tax year, the year that comes due, because they'll treat the cancellation of debt as taxable income, which is a fun thing you can learn about if you go to law school. And hopefully maybe Elizabeth Warren will help get that fixed by the time you're eligible for it. But currently, I think that is still an issue with it.
I know the advice that like my law school gives out to incoming students is basically like, don't depend on that, which is, I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it does change a lot. And I know a lot of folks personally who thought they were making like the correct payments for, you know, a very long time, and then found out that they were not making the correct type of payment, and then it just like disqualified every single payment that they'd made. So you know, I think it is something that you'll have to like look into like super carefully, and you know, that doesn't mean it like won't work for you, but just like be very careful and try to make sure that you're checking all the right boxes and crossing your T's and dotting your I's and all that.
Okay, one more quick question relating to that last question. It says, why does that count as taxable income?
Oh, see, this is a fun thing. Also, if you go to law school, so one of the things I did was I used to do the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Clinic, when I was in law school. So it would help folks do their like file their taxes, because it's actually a net benefit for DC. The amount of money they spend to help support the program, and because it's done with volunteers mostly, the few people they pay to supervise the volunteers, it generates more income for the city and people getting larger returns because they actually file appropriately, and it helps low income folks get that money back from the federal government. But because of that, that's just like the standard rule, the cancellation of debt is treated the same as income, because basically like you would have to have used income to pay off that debt, but instead it has been canceled. So someone else is taking it off their balance sheets. And a lot of that has to do too with like, you know, the folks who canceled the debt might be able to write off that debt cancellation as a loss. So then the government needs to make that up somewhere else.
Awesome. Oh, John, were you going to say something?
I was going to say I learned something today. I didn't know that.
Awesome. Okay, so if you have any questions that you didn't put in the chat, but you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to ask.
I have a question. So I was wondering, would you guys recommend basically doing campaign work? Because I remember it was mentioned, would you guys recommend basically kind of, I guess, getting experience more before going to law school, and then getting either your degree later? And also, what kind of advice would you give, I guess, to people who are seeking, you know, kind of just passing the bar, because that's kind of like a scare for people, you know, you never really know what could happen or if you are going to pass or not. So what's kind of some advice for that? And yeah, I mean, and also because I was looking into like a JD degree, a 2-year JD degree program. Would you guys kind of recommend kind of doing a 2-year law degree program and kind of going into the field after, or just kind of really taking the 4-year or the 6-year route with law school in particular? Yeah, hopefully you remember all the questions I asked. I'm sorry.
Are there 4-year and 6-year programs? I know there are some like night school programs that I go for 4 years. I don't have a view on
Yeah, I know. Yeah, typically, so you can do basically like a 4 to 6-year program, but there are schools who offer you to basically get your JD in 2 years, like they have a 2-year JD degree program. But yeah, you can do overnight if you like.
I don't have a strong view on it. I mean, I think law school's pretty short as it is. At 3 years is what I took it in. And you know, it can be a wild world, Wild West once you get out. So I wouldn't recommend taking it faster, certainly, because especially if you haven't spent time between college and law school, right? I think I took 2 years. You know, I part of my work then was I was on a presidential campaign. You know, I think it's good just to find your footing in the world. So you hit law school and you know, while you're swimming in a sea of like tort law and property law and things that maybe you don't care a ton about, you sort of know what goal you're driving at, or know like 3 or 5 goals that or areas that you think you're interested in. I personally think it's a good idea to come into law school with some experience. I mean, it depends on what that experience will be, but I knew tons of people who went like worked in Teach for America for 2 years, or, you know, were in the Peace Corps, you know, worked in an organization in a, you know, program associate sort of role for 2 years, 3 years, or longer. Some people come in, you know, years in, but they hit law school and they know like exactly what they want. And so like they aren't like swimming in a sea of different opportunities when it comes time to apply for internships or fellowships. And they're more, to be honest, they're more convincing as applicants, right? Because they know they can convincingly say this is what they want to do with their lives, right? And they have experience in the field, and they don't have to say this is one of the 4 or 5 things I'm considering doing. Say this is sort of what I came to law school to do.
Yeah, I will put in a plug for doing campaign work. I think even if you don't do it full time, I think getting involved in a political campaign is a real fun experience. It really shows you like what is going on behind the curtain. And it's also one of those things where like every campaign is basically like a startup corporation that like has to get to scale by election day, and then it goes away. So there's also, I think, I have found campaigns to be a relatively meritocratic place where like if you get involved and you are committed to doing the work, there's always more that needs to be done, and there's always responsibility to be had. And if you're willing to show up and work hard, then you can find yourself with a lot of responsibility very quickly and really be able to help steer the ship on something that could have a real impact on your local community in a really meaningful way. So would put a plug in for that if you can make the time for it. I think like, I don't know, I thought about it too. I loved my job that I had before law school, but like I said, given the hours that I was working, like it would not have even really worked for me to do a night program and still keep my job. So once I figured that out, it didn't really make sense for me to find a new job to have during the day to then go to law school at night. I just sort of left my job and then just went full time and just dedicated myself to it. Did a standard 3-year program and got it wrapped up, and was able to also do all those other things during law school. So I was able to do some of that other type of work, like doing the tax clinic and volunteering for that, and doing some other internships and programs, and doing a journal, and having time for those types of activities.
Yeah, I also really liked my 3-year law school experience. You know, one of the things I was looking for in a law school was a close-knit community, people who I would get along with, people who cared about each other. And I really found that in law school, found lots of little communities too. And, you know, I think that would be harder to get either on a condensed schedule or on like a night schedule. But at the same time, that might not be something that's one of your top priorities as it was for me. So, you know, at the end of the day, if that's what works best with like your schedule or your finances or, you know, whatever it is, like absolutely you can make it work. And I also think we're in an interesting time because like the American Bar Association controls what law schools can and cannot do. And they've had to change and relax so many of their rules because of the pandemic. And we're realizing that a lot of the things that we thought were necessary, the, you know, constant in-person classes, you know, certain numbers of hours for different things, like those aren't as necessary as we thought they were. Well, I never thought they were necessary, but as they thought they were. And, you know, I think we are seeing this big shift in legal education. And, you know, law moves very slowly, I think, compared to other industries. It takes a while to catch up. But I think like the pandemic has changed some of that. So, you know, if there are unique programs that law schools are opening, you know, I think you should totally look into them and like maybe take advantage of them. I'm trying to remember what like, your other questions were. Oh, you asked about the bar exam. I can't really help there. I didn't end up taking the bar exam, but I got licensed in Washington State because they passed everyone through because of the pandemic, which I'm very lucky to have had happen. But I do just want to say that, like, you know, if it's okay if you do not pass the bar exam, it's like lots of people don't pass the bar exam on their first try, and you know it's set up so that people fail, and that's not a reflection on you, that's a reflection on the system that we have set up. And you know, I really want to hammer home, like for now and for like the next 3 years, whenever you go to law school, like that's not the end of the world, and it will be okay no matter what happens.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for answering that last question. So just before we wrap things up, would each of you give a piece of advice to students on this call? Just any piece of advice that you can think of, law school or no law school, just in general. So John, if you want to start this one.
Sure. And I usually, I say the same thing at every panel of this nature that I've participated in, which is that when you go to law school, if you go to law school, right, there will be a lot of people sort of looking over their shoulder, looking what other people are doing, what internships they're getting, who are they clerking for, what grades are they getting. And I think the most important thing is to remember that you're not in competition with those people, right? You're in competition with yourself. And the scariest thing I think in life can be to sort of just go through the motions and get a job that you don't care about, aren't passionate about, and not be driving yourself to create something new and to, because you're on this call, I know you want to make other people's lives better. So you're in competition with yourself, and all of that other stuff, all of the noise, all of the sort of sharp elbows that you will encounter in certain law schools, maybe not everywhere, none of that matters. I think the thing that matters is to sort of just be testing yourself to see if you can, whether you're in law school and when you're a young lawyer, can you, come up with a new way of doing things that people who've come before you haven't thought of yet. That's, I think, should be, if you make that your goal and not sort of the rat race, that exists in the legal industry. If you're in a rat race, you're still a rat. So get out of the rat race and focus on just being the best version, of yourself as a lawyer that you can be. That's my advice.
Yeah, I think my general piece of advice that I always give folks is also just like show up. Maybe especially post-pandemic, I think that'll be a little bit easier to do in real life again. But like the way I got involved in a number of things in college was just showing up to something and then kept showing up until, that's like, I think the positive version of like fake it until you make it is just like show up, try and say yes if you can, and then like see what you can do, because like the world is an amazing and vast place, but it is also full of problems, and like we need people who want to solve problems, and the way you solve problems is you show up and you say yes when something needs to get done. So that is, I think, something that has gotten me through a lot of steps of my career. So that is what I can provide here, and hopefully that works for you too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of those things. I find you're going to probably fall short sometimes during law school. It happens to everybody. That's the way the curve is set up. That's the way the whole system is set up. So like my advice to people entering law school is to find something that you are successful at that isn't, numbers based. Whether that's forming relationships or meeting with other students, or something completely outside of law school, like working out or being part of some other type of club. Just find something that brings you joy and that will make you feel successful on the days that you don't feel successful in class.
That advice is real for everyone. As a PhD student, I'm like, yes, I need to like, and the cool thing is that this job helps me find joy, which is pretty remarkable. And you all have brought me joy tonight. So I really, really want to thank John, Katie, Mike, and especially Macklin. Y'all, this is her first panel she's ever moderated. Wow. Thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. I would love for you to put in the chat what political profession you want us to feature next month. And if you're interested in possibly participating in helping making these panels work, get a hold of me on Slack and I'll talk to your state coordinator to see if we can work something out. Thank you again so very much to our panelists. I thought this was really phenomenal and I hope you all did too. Have a really wonderful evening, y'all.
Thanks very much. Thanks for organizing.